afternoon. Welcome to Lost Son with Brett Forrest. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. We are very pleased to have Brett with us today, and he is in conversation with our historian and curator, Dr. Andrew Hammond. Before I turn this over to Andrew, just a few words about Brett. He is a national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C. His investigative work often focuses on the former Soviet Union. Lost Son, his amazing book, is an expansion of his journal investigation into the disappearance in Russia of an FBI source. Brett has also covered the war in Ukraine and was the first reporter into the Kiev suburb of Bucha after Russia's military withdrawal, where he broke news of alleged atrocities. Brett previously authored The Big Fix, an international crime bestseller. He co-directed the ESPN ABC true crime documentary Pin Kings, an Emmy finalist, and was formerly a senior writer at ESPN, where he reported on sports and crime and shared the National Magazine Award for General Excellence. His international affairs reporting has appeared in Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, National Geographic, the New York Times Magazine, Foreign Policy, and the Best American Science and Nature writing. And there are other incredible tidbits that don't belong here, but Brett, you have had an amazing career and an ongoing one. So when Andrew and Brett finish their discussion, if you've been with us before, we'll turn to you for your questions. Just a reminder, please use the Q&A feature to write them in. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, over to you, Andrew and Brett.
Thank you. Well, I'm really looking forward to speaking to you, Brett, and I should very briefly add to Amanda's excellent introduction that you're also the author of The Great Vodka Taste Test, a Vanity Fair article, which was very interesting about high-end Russian vodka. Nevertheless, we're here to talk about Lost Son, your book that just came out the other week. So I just wondered, for our listeners, let's just set the scene. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you came across this story, how you walked into it, stumbled across it, or how it came to you as a journalist?
Certainly, it's a good place to start. And Andrew, thank you very much for having me on. It's really a pleasure to be with you here. The book just published last week, so this is really a thrill to speak to your audience, which might have an inclination to be interested in such topics. So, great question about the origin of this story. You know, as journalists, we're always looking for stories that really capture us, right? And I remember it was December 2017, if you can think back that long ago, when I was in the offices at the Wall Street Journal in Washington. It was a Friday afternoon, and my phone rang, and it was a gentleman, an American I've known through contacts in Ukraine and Russia for a number of years, a guy named Bob Forsman, who was a banker years in Russia and had a lot of really strong contacts in the Kremlin and in the Russian Orthodox Church, dating back to the 90s. And he and I had been talking around a certain topic. He wasn't quite ready to share it, but he called me that day and he felt it was time. And what he knew was very little, but what he told me was that there was a young man from Michigan in his 20s who had worked for the FBI as a source for about 5 years, mostly in counterterrorism. And when the war in Ukraine broke out in 2014, if you remember, Russia annexed Crimea and then fomented war in the eastern part of the country. This young man, Billy Reilly, a year after that in 2015, traveled to Russia. He kept in touch with his parents while he was there. And then suddenly one day, his communication stopped. Now, Bob Forsman, on that phone call, he told me also that very soon after Billy's communications dropped, there was a knock at the door of the family home in Michigan, and it was his FBI handler, Billy's FBI handler. He had never visited the home. He had never met the family. And he professed ignorance of Billy's trip to Russia, But very soon thereafter, he and his colleagues began confiscating devices from the home and then shut out the family completely. And that's all Bob knew. And that's all he told me on the phone call. But I instantly saw the makings of a great story. And possibly I foresaw this day when the book would come out. It was that crystal clear to me because I saw in Billy a character who could bridge the gap between the global war on terror. This is someone who came of age after 9/11. He was in high school when it happened. And Russia's war in Ukraine. And I saw that Billy's usage of social media layered a modern layer, if you will, on top of the story. And to me, it had the potential immediately of being a modern American fable.
It's quite interesting looking at some of your other work, your books, the long bomb, and the big fix. So one on the ex NFL and looking at how that has played out in terms of TV and success or otherwise, and then the other one looking at match fixing for soccer matches. And then even some of your more recent writing that's still on Ukraine, on Daniel Smith, the Navy SEAL who couldn't stop fighting and ends up going to Ukraine. And then the other one, Denise Kiryev, who's also in this murky space that Billy Reilly, the protagonist of Lost Son, is also sharing. So just before we dig deeper into the story, is there something that attracts you to these stories, or is this is just what makes a good story? It's not necessarily me, it's just these are what make good stories.
Sure. Well, as professionals, as journalists, or really anybody in any professional field with ambition and drive, we grow through time, right? And we learn things, and we find new interests, and often we find interests that really do grab us, and we dig very deeply into them over a number of years. And that's what happened with me when I moved to Russia in 2002. I'd never been to the country, and there was something about Russia and also Ukraine that really just grabbed me, and it diverted the path of my life to where we are now, where I do cover a lot of issues in that part of the world. As we mentioned earlier, I've been covering the war in Ukraine from last year onwards. The earlier works that you mentioned, I come from a sports family. My father was a sportscaster, and I grew up doing sound on his crews at games and watching him piece together stories on the fly. And that was kind of my journalism school, if you will. So I have that background, but over time, I became more interested in things that were a little more serious. And I hope that this book that's out now will show that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it would be quite interesting. In the opening chapters of the book, you do a nice job of setting the scene, of taking the listener to northern Michigan, to Oxford, where Billy Reilly grew up, and to the family, to the locale, to the trials and tribulations of a relatively conservative town at the north of Michigan. So can you just set the scene for our viewers, like help them understand the story through that lens of place and of time?
Yeah, Oxford, Michigan, this is where Billy Reilly was from. And Oxford is, you could say it's in the Detroit area. It's kind of just outside of what's typically referred to as distinction, because so many suburbs and towns of Detroit have for more than 100 years been yoked to the auto industry, whereas Oxford really never got a taste of that, aside from being at one point the largest source of gravel in the world, which was used to make the roads that the Model T and all the other cars that were being made in Detroit were eventually riding upon. But Oxford has always been much quieter, much more of it has an agrarian past, of course, but it never really became an auto industry boomtown. It's sort of it's a town of many lakes and houses, built upon those lakes with beautiful views. But it's not a town where you would ordinarily find people who were industriously driving for new solutions to things in life, right? This is a quieter, and it necessarily then is a place that for someone like Billy would feel maybe a little too small, because he was so eager once he began to learn about the wider world. And I'm not talking about just outside of Michigan, but outside of the United States. He was so eager to be a part of events. He was so eager to make his life matter.
And let's talk about that meeting up of Billy Reilly with this bigger story, with these international events. So we have this young man coming of age in Oxford, Michigan. He's growing up, he's getting older, and then eventually he comes into contact with international relations, international conflict. He has flags of Palestine and Chechnya in his bedroom. He's begins to learn Arabic and Russian. He takes an interest in these types of things that are happening across the world. And I know that 9/11 has an important, it's an important pivot in his life. So just help us understand how this young man starts meeting up with the world of international relations and international conflict.
Yeah. Well, I remember being in New York on 9/11, and in the weeks and months after that, I remember hearing somebody say, now is not the time to write about 9/11 because we don't really know yet what it means, right? And you look at Billy Reilly. Billy Reilly was in high school during 9/11. And for him, it took many years for us to really see clearly the effect that the terrorist attacks had on him. And you have to imagine, too, that so many Americans of that age group, who were in high school, so impressionable when that happened. It did divert many lives into new directions. And that was certainly true with Billy. The effect it had on Billy was fundamentally, it opened the world to him. It made him question the reason behind 9/11. He was unfamiliar with Islam, the Arab world. He didn't know anything about it, but 9/11 made him curious about it. So he started reading up on it on his own, completely on his own. And he wasn't particularly a great student, but he began to follow his own curriculum privately at home. Like you said, he began teaching himself Arabic and also Russian, obviously two very difficult languages. He didn't have a teacher. He was just doing it all online, and he became very proficient. So he was showing the signs of someone who had great interest in important things, someone with real intelligence, and someone with curiosity and drive. And that's essentially what led him into the arms of the FBI, because Billy was conversing with people in internet forums and social media who were sort of on the fringe of radical Islam globally. And I think for Billy, it was more like, he told his mother that it was more like a video game for him. It was like a challenge to see if he could get certain passwords to get into certain locked areas online. And because of his interest in these issues and his developing language skills, he was able to sort of pass himself off adequately to gain access to certain areas. Well, the FBI eventually caught wind of his internet activity and one day came knocking at the door.
And how genuine was his conversion to Islam? Was it a kind of contrarian or youthful rebellion, or was it a wholesale espousal? Was it periodic? Did he carry it with him through all of the events that he gets caught up in later on in Russia and so forth? Yeah, help us understand that. And I know that his sister marries a Muslim man as well, and she is part of that. And then I think it would also be interesting to connect this to Dearborn and Detroit as the quote unquote Arab capital of the United States. So just help us understand that the relationship between the two siblings and their conversion, and then the greater Detroit area and the types of demographic realities around there.
Right. Well, when I first learned of the story, I was interested in the points that I shared earlier, and I didn't know anything about this side of the family. And I was fascinated when I learned that that Billy Reilly and his sister Katie, they had grown up in a Catholic family. Um, not
Half
a
Irish, half Irish, half Polish, which is pretty much as Catholic as you can get, right?
right, right in the Detroit area. I mean, this is sort of a pretty large community there, of Poles and of Irish, and of course there's a lot of mixing there over the years. So this is a community with a pretty strong identity, and so 9/11 walked Billy down the path to a sincere interest in Islam, the religion, and within a year of 9/11. He began telling people at school that he had converted. I mean, he was going to a Catholic school. He and Katie, his sister, were both students at a Catholic school at that time. And Billy sometimes would sit in the back of the class reading the Quran in a Catholic school, right, which required its students to attend Mass. How genuine was it? Well, that's an open question, because this is something that Billy did while he was in high school. We've all been in high school, and we all know that when you're going through these changes, you're trying to establish your independence, right? And you're trying to figure out what kind of person you are. So I think at first, in fact, I know at first he was quite zealous, and over time, however, that began to fade. It really depends who you talk to, whether you talk to Katie, as you mentioned, she also converted, or if you talk to his parents. It's a little bit hard to tell. My read on it is that as he grew and matured, it was always a part of his life, but it wasn't the central part of his life.
And then help us understand how he comes into contact with the world of intelligence. So he's quite proficient online. He is quite savvy about online forums and so forth. He has learned Russian and Arabic to a considerable degree. So he can sort of find his way around online, and help us understand how he first comes into contact with the world that we deal with at the Spy Museum, the world of intelligence and espionage.
Sure. Well, this is the story that an FBI agent told the family. Because one day, just as Billy was preparing to graduate college, he was, I believe, about 23 years old, unsure what to do with his life after college, looking for a direction, as many of us are at that age. There was a knock at the door, and it was an FBI agent. And the story he told was that in the Middle East, the US military had come upon an enemy position, and they had begun going through what had been left behind. At some point, and this is called, in the parlance, called a sensitive site exploitation. They said, the FBI agent said that during this procedure, a hard drive was recovered. And when they went through it, they found internet traffic with someone using an internet service provider in the US. Now, when that's the case, when the CIA or other agencies or the military abroad comes upon investigative leads that originate in the US, they're required, or they're supposed to, hand that off to the FBI. And that's what happened in this case, at least according to the FBI agent who came to the house. Apparently then the ISP, the internet service provider address that was found on that hard drive in the Middle East, it was registered to a William Reilly in Oxford, Michigan, at the address of the Reilly's home. So the FBI agent came, and he had a folder. Billy's parents greeted him at the door, and they saw sticking out of the folder, they saw a printout of Billy's father's driver's license. The thing is, Billy was the 8th William Reilly, so he and his father shared the same name. And it turns out the FBI thought it was actually the dad, but the parents said, we know what's going on here because our son has been telling us about his interests for years now. And in fact, his mother had warned him years before that the FBI was indeed going to come to the house. And here the FBI was, and that's really where it began.
Well, as someone whose father is also called Andrew, I'm well versed in some of the complications that can come from that. Thankfully, none quite as serious as this. So he comes into contact with the FBI through this. How does he start working for the FBI, and in what capacity?
Well, I think initially, look, Robert Mueller, the former FBI director after 9/11, remember he was the director when 9/11 happened, and he mandated that his agents run down every single lead. You can understand why he did that. We all remember those times. But as the years wore on, FBI agents began to chafe at that mandate because, as you can imagine, most leads don't go anywhere, but they still had to do it. And one potential benefit, however, in running down all these leads was in developing sources, informants, cooperators, et cetera. These are people who have been the foundation of FBI work really since the beginning of the agency. And in 2004, the Bureau underwent what it called the Confidential Human Source Re-engineering Project. And that basically, that took all cooperators and informants and put them in the same group. But then it began to add a new type of person, which could help in intelligence, because the FBI was transforming into an intelligence agency after 9/11. And so when the FBI agents came to the door of the Reilly's house and began asking Billy Reilly how he got access to certain areas online and to certain people online and why he had done it, that FBI agent realized this guy could make a good source for us because he's already doing the kind of work that we need done. And as it turned out, the FBI really lacked people who had such skills, who had the language skills that Billy had, who could not only, and because the other thing is, like, the FBI could sometimes teach people a language, at least to some degree, but it couldn't teach the sort of cultural knowledge that Billy had developed through his own personal interests. So when he came in contact with people online, it was easy for him to sort of pass himself off. And that's what the FBI recognized in Billy, and they scooped him up.
And he's working for them, basically trying to penetrate online forums and so forth, and use pseudonyms, use cover names, and basically inform the FBI about radicalization and so forth that's happening online. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, his relationship with the FBI, like so many CHSs, as they came to be called, confidential human sources, began small and built upwards to more serious tasks. So you're right. Initially, he was scanning mostly Arabic language information abroad, using his knowledge of people and places and issues, finding things of value and translating and synthesizing this information and sending reports, regular reports, to his FBI handlers. From there, it grew because after that, we all remember the Arab Spring, and that precipitated the rise of ISIS. So he became very involved in all of this, mostly from behind the computer. Eventually, he stepped out from behind the computer, and his FBI handlers had him contact investigative targets into the Detroit area and go meet them personally while wearing listening devices with an FBI tail, using a pseudonym, and trying to get close to people that the FBI believed were parts of potential terror plots.
So I want to walk up to when he goes to Russia, which comes a little bit later in the story, but there's a few interesting events that happen in between, starting his beginning of the work for the FBI and then him going to Russia. And there's some kind of strange ones, going to rallies and shouting Heil Hitler, and another one where he tries to entrap an Iraqi, and the Iraqi smells that something's off and then turns the table on him. So could you outline just both of those stories? I'm just trying to get a sense of that intervening period before he goes to Russia.
Sure. Well, the first episode you mentioned is actually, it was a George W. Bush political rally in Detroit that he attended with his sister and his parents. And Billy and his sister were really upset about the invasion, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. They felt it was criminal and it had no basis. So they went there in opposition to the president. And when he appeared on stage, you're right, Billy shouted Heil Hitler and many other epithets. Actually got into a conflict, a physical altercation with another gentleman there, and punches flew. So you could see Billy's passion for these issues. And later, like you said, when he was working with the FBI, they had him target an Iraqi American named Nasser, who had actually served as an interpreter for the Marines in Iraq in uniform, but later back in the United States became, I guess you could say, radicalized, and became an FBI target. And Billy Reilly went after him under a pseudonym, actually contacting him through his YouTube channel. And Billy, in doing field work, he had trouble passing himself off as who he said he was. And Nasser, as you mentioned, did turn the tables, took control of the relationship. And Nasser himself eventually did serve prison time, but Billy wasn't particularly effective in that role.
So let's come up to him going to Russia. So he begins working for the FBI. We've spoke about Crimea, the Donbass, things that are still playing out now. And I want to leave a little bit of time to discuss your time more recently in Ukraine. But yeah, why does he go to Russia? How does he end up there? Just help our viewers just understand that part of the story, which is very, very important for the denouement.
Well, that's really where the story turns, because up until that point, we kind of have a pretty linear narrative. And we understand Billy's choices. We understand that when he's graduating college and he's a little aimless, the opportunity with the FBI seems really exciting, and he will learn practical skills that might help him in a future career. We understand why the FBI wanted to bring him on, and we understand the parents' sort of excitement, if you will, at their son's association with the FBI. They all think very positively of the FBI, although they don't know much about the Bureau. When he goes to Russia, when Billy goes to Russia, everything becomes very different for him and his family and the FBI, at least in terms of his case. So he tells his parents in 2015, a year plus after the events in Crimea and Donbass, that he is going to Russia. His parents are flummoxed by this. They don't understand why he would go, and if he's going for the FBI or just having an personal adventure, and they don't quite understand what he's going to do there. And at this point, 5 years into his relationship with the FBI, Billy has become really adept at sharing some information, but never quite enough. Leaving his family kind of in the dark, but also making them feel like they're along for the ride. Because he's been encouraged by the FBI to become the type of person who's targeting people through lies and deceit. But that's the job of the CHS quite often. And Billy has become a very adept one. So even with his family, he's not really giving them the full story. And his parents sense that something is off. They try their best to discourage him from going. But ultimately, Billy, at this point, he's 28 years old. He's an adult. He's a driven person with his own mind, and he's determined to go. And he goes to Russia in May 2015, flies to Moscow, and he's on a new adventure.
And this is where the story gets murky, right? He goes to Russia. And for Russians, he says he's Vasily. For Arabs, he says he's Bilal. Or for Muslims, sorry. But it seems to me that I don't really see the FBI. I don't see a lot of concrete evidence that this was an FBI, objective for an FBI operation. So, for example, you outline it in the book, turning up in a war zone with an oversized suitcase on wheels is not typically how soldiers of fortune or, you know, seasoned intelligence operatives would kind of like do that. He seemed a bit like this kid who had grown up in northern Michigan and not seen much of the world, and, you know, kind of was in over his head. So just help us understand that, because that's the part that where the story seems to get a bit blurry, which is one of the reasons it's interesting, right?
Well, I certainly believe so. You know, this is one of those stories where, you know, we did learn a lot. We did unravel a lot. We unraveled some of the most fundamental parts of this mystery, but some elements remain. And that's one reason why I hope that this is the kind of book that will stay with people, because of these questions. But more pointedly to your question, you're right. We don't know exactly his purpose in going to Russia, right? We don't know if he went completely on his own, and we know that he was looking at his approaching 30th birthday and telling his family that he wanted to have a real adventure before he was 30. I mean, this is something that he voiced. And we know that before that, he had some fits and starts with embarking on real adventures. But at the same time, we do know that the FBI prevaricated with the family until the family was actually able to uncover incontrovertible proof that the FBI knew about his trip before he went on it, and that there was also discussion of communication while he was on the road. We also have great contextual knowledge about how the FBI, especially after 9/11, came to cooperate more closely, more fully with the CIA and other law enforcement and intelligence bodies in the US, down to the fact that CHS's, confidential human sources like Billy, were often freely traded amongst the agencies and still are traded today. You know, I've talked to former FBI agents who've told me how CHSs that they've known or developed have gone on to work for the CIA and other agencies, and indeed been sent abroad into dangerous places. So on the face of it, you might say, well, Billy Reilly was not a real professional spy. He was a rank amateur drawn into professional intelligence. And why would the FBI or another US agency send him into probably the most challenging counterintelligence environment in the world for US assets, Russia? What could they possibly hope to gain from doing that? But on the other hand, and this happened to me throughout the reporting and research of this story, on the other hand, you know, I would always find evidence and historical context to think otherwise. You know, other cases where other people, kind of like Billy, were sent into dangerous places. So the FBI has not been forthcoming, and until they are, we're probably unlikely to know the full truth.
Okay, I just, you know, the story of Billy, it's really tragic, and the way that you outline it in the book, you know, the family, his parents, I mean, they've just had such a, you know, it's just been this terrible experience that most of us can't even imagine. I'm just trying to get a sense though of, you know, in the book, it does seem like the FBI are on the hook, so to speak, and I don't have any skin in the game. I'm just trying to follow the evidence. There doesn't, you know, contextual evidence is one thing, and you know, being cagey, I mean, that's kind of what intelligence agencies do. So it's not necessarily evidence of a nefarious activity in the background. And then there's always the thing that people say, you know, whenever you see some kind of, you know, attempt to dangle the strings of bureaucracies and manage stories and so forth, what you're probably seeing most of the time is just good old-fashioned bureaucratic incompetence, or, you know, people not talking to each other. I mean, even in the smallest organizations, not everybody's on the same page. So, again, I'm not, I'm not like arguing for one position or another. I'm just saying, what concrete evidence do we have to say that the FBI are on the hook for this, as I put it? And I think another thing that I would just say would be, there is he's this young man who has a particular type of personality and a particular skill set and so forth, and he's very much out of his depth when he goes to Russia. Is there not also a danger in taking some agency away from him? Some people would say, well, this is a grown man who's made a decision. Why is it someone else's fault? Like, why? So I'm just giving them as prompts to talk around the issue.
Yeah, well, I'm like you. I also have no skin in this game. I want to be clear about that. I'm just a reporter. I'm just trying to put facts together and present them in a cogent way for the reader. But I'll say this also, because you make a good point. Billy was an adult. He did make his own choices. He could have told the FBI at any point, this has been great, but I'm going to take a new path. It's been nice knowing you. But he didn't. He continued working with the FBI. But I'll say this, so often we think of government as a monolith, but it's not. Government is made of people. And some of these people, such as FBI agents, we grant special powers. And in return, they should grant us something, accountability. And in this case, there's no accountability for what happened to Billy Reilly. So we can't answer that question. We're unable to answer that question of whether he went to Russia on his own or with the FBI's approval or encouragement. What we do have is we have hard evidence that the FBI lied about its foreknowledge of his trip. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Because every lie has a motive. That's all I'll say about it.
Okay. Yeah, you're even on trying to uncover information, us historians are still trying to find out things that happened 50 years ago now, never mind a few years ago. So yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting. But like, for the foreknowledge, just for our viewers, what is the incontrovertible proof that the FBI knew, and how do we know that this wasn't? How do we know that this was a considered deception as opposed to just, no, that never happened, and then your memory gets jogged and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, it did. So yeah, I'm just kind of like probing through some of the parts of this.
Well, I'm sorry, Andrew. This is a part of our conversation where I'm just going to tell you and others, just got to read it. But it's
well,
in there.
I mean, I would encourage that too, and I have read it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a part of there's a moment in the book when Billy's parents discover something that they didn't know they possessed, and this is the proof. This, while at the same time Billy's handler is saying one thing, they have proof that he actually. He's saying he doesn't know something, and they have proof that says that he actually did know it and participated in it. And that is really a strong turning point again in the parent story, where they realize that whereas before they thought the FBI was working in concert with them to locate Billy, they understand now that the FBI is indeed working against them.
And I'm being somewhat disingenuous because most of my questions seem to appear that I don't have a clue what is going on, but I have read your book and I do know how it all plays out. But yeah, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the viewer. So let's.
We appreciate that, Andrew. We appreciate. Thank you.
I do too.
So let's move forward and just discuss the FSB, because before we go on to your more recent experience in the Ukraine, I just want to discuss this because this is a really fascinating agency, the FSB. So this is really a very empowered agency in Putin's Russia. It's one that we've looked at before in previous programs. So Billy ends up being around the FSB, and not, Billy can be forgiven for not being an expert on the FSB or necessarily knowing all of their history, but for people, most people at the Spy Museum, as soon as you hear the words FSB, your first reaction is eject cord, I need to get out of here. So just help us understand Billy's interaction with the FSB.
Right. Well, I mean, I imagine there might be some out there who don't know what that is. It's the Federal Security.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
And it is one of the agencies that came out of when the Soviet Union fell, and the KGB sort of had a restructuring. That was the sort of main piece of the KGB that survived a reorganization. It is also the agency that is in charge of all counterintelligence for Russia. So anytime somebody appears on their radar domestically, and they have questions about whether this person is performing espionage, it's the FSB's counterintelligence unit that focuses on that person. Yeah, I mean, anytime an American shows up at a volunteer fighter camp in Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia, right near the border of Ukraine, and people don't know quite why he's there, it is the FSB's duty to look into that. Their styles differ, of course, but it would be the FBI's counterintelligence responsibility to do the same for a questionable Russian or another foreigner in the U.S., especially someone who's sort of nosing around military issues, such as Billy was doing. So it would be a dereliction of duty on the FSB's part if it didn't look into what Billy was doing and who he was and what his background was. So, it's hard really to know Billy's depth of understanding at that point. Like, did he really know who was looking at him and who was around him? I don't think he did. I think at some point he knew that things were getting a little bit off the rails for him, and that he was being lied to about certain activities that had been promised to him. But I don't think he ever really got his head around, the depth of his troubles.
And in case viewers are wondering, we're keeping the end of the story under wraps and encouraging you to read the book. So we're not trying to tease you, but I'm just wondering if you see the FSB as involved in the ultimate way the story plays out.
Well, I'd love to answer that question, but that piece of information is vital to the story, and it does come, quite late in the book. But I'll say this, that Billy's disappearance was no accident.
Okay, so let's just before we move on to questions, just tell us a little bit more about your engagement with this part of the world, Brett. I think your story is really interesting. You just go to Russia, you get introduced to Ukraine in 2002 through going there for a wedding. You fell in love with Ukraine, but you've obviously spent a lot of time in Russia as well. So you probably have a better understanding than probably most of the viewers, and certainly more than me, of what's going on over there. So just help us understand the conflict through your eyes. I know that you were there again, 2002, fell in love, found the city very enchanting, and then after the war happened, you were the first reporter on the ground in Bochna, I think that's how you pronounce it, one of the suburbs of Kiev, to go and investigate reports of atrocities. So just help us understand your engagement with the region and how you're making sense of the war that's taking place there.
Well, this is one of those rare stories.
Big question. Sorry.
This is one of those stories, rare stories for me at least, where I'm actually in the story. You never really want to be a part of the story. You want to, be telling the story. But because in the end, I got so involved in investigating what happened to Billy and was personally involved in the sort of resolution of the case. I couldn't not be a part of it. So there's a point in the book where I appear, and then my editor and I were talking it over, of course, and he felt, and I came to agree with him, that the reader sort of does ache for a little bit of knowledge about the narrator at that point. Like, why should we trust you about this part of the world? So I do go into a little bit of that personal history, and as I mentioned earlier, I just went to, well, when I went to Russia and Ukraine for the first time in 2002, that's where my life really diverted and I took a different path. I mean, I went to Moscow just to visit a friend. I was living in New York at the time, and my friend from New York had gotten a job in Russia. And I just went for 2 weeks to visit him, and I was completely captivated by the place. You have to remember, it was a very different time than today. 2002, Vladimir Putin was still pretty new as the Russian president. We were still trying to figure him out, and I think he was trying to figure out his own sort of leadership style. Remember, back in those times, he was quite close with George W. Bush. They spent time together on Bush's ranch in Texas. Imagine that happening now, right? Very different time, and that attitude, and though we were almost like the countries were almost friendly, if you will. And that attitude sort of filtered down to just regular folks. And I was just, as I mentioned, captivated by Russian people, captivated by Ukrainian people. Spent a lot of time in Kiev. Eventually, I moved to Moscow, lived there for 5 years. Later, I lived in Ukraine, in Kiev, and I was spending a lot of time traveling broadly in both countries for work and pleasure, and making a lot of friends and contacts. So when the war broke out, when the broader invasion broke out last year, I was in Kiev that day, February 24th, for the Wall Street Journal with a couple of colleagues, and we just began reporting on the war. It was obviously it's a time that's very hard to describe, just very confusing. We didn't know where the Russians were. We knew they were dropping in paratroopers close by. We didn't know if they were going to storm the hotel at any moment, and what might happen to us. And then later, about a month plus later, as you mentioned, I drove into the Kiev suburb of Bucha. And this was the one day after Russia's military withdrawal, and nobody really knew what had happened there yet. It just fluke of timing. I happened to be the first one there, and I arrived just as the local militia was reinstalling the Ukrainian flag on the local administration building and singing the national anthem. We pulled up right when that was going on, and you could sense the special timing. And I sort of brokered an agreement with the local militia leader. He gave me a couple of his guys, and we went around town trying to avoid, the booby traps that the Russians had set. And that gave us a firsthand view at the atrocities. I mean, the Ukrainians hadn't had any time yet to clean up the city, and there was human carnage everywhere, and every sort of imaginable condition. Something very difficult to witness. But it was time to get to work, because at some point I realized what I was looking at and how important it was to get the word out about it.
And just very briefly before we turn over to Amanda, in all your time in the region, did you, I'm assuming you intersected with the FSB, with Ukrainian intelligence? Did you ever feel your shoulder rubbing up against theirs? And yeah, just maybe a brief example of what it's like to report in that region.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, we're talking about a 20-year period when conditions drastically changed, but gradually. So yeah, certainly I've had minders over there. I've had plenty of run-ins with police, with intelligence in both countries, and I've been stopped at airports and arrested, and nothing as serious as our colleague Evan Gershkovich is undergoing now. But for example, in the author's note at the beginning of this book, I describe how in 2019, as I'm leaving Russia after working on the Billy Reilly case, at the airport, I'm pulled aside by an FSB agent and, taken for questioning in the back. And then there's another guy comes in and, sort of got to talk your way through all that. But yeah, so now things are totally different. Now, whereas before it might have been sort of a fun adventure and you felt like if you had an accreditation from the Russian Foreign Ministry and you were a Westerner, particularly an American journalist, that you were sort of untouchable. Well, now things are different, as we've seen, and now you're more of a target. So things have really flipped.
Okay, well, it's been great to speak to you. Over to Amanda.
Hi, this has been so interesting. And as the mom of a 20-year-old, I just hope he sticks with baseball. And so I'll say he's listening from the other room. So this is quite a story. And I have a few questions that I don't know if you'll answer, Brett.
I'm ready.
We'll give it a whirl. So I think this question came in before the program and again during the program. Is there anything that the FBI could have done, anything from your perspective that they could do to take more accountability that you think could actually happen? We know you don't work for the FBI.
Right. Well, I had an answer ready until you said the last part that could actually happen. That's really the trick here.
Oh, well, you can take that part away. I added that on.
Oh, I see. Well, it's actually an interesting layer because I do know what the FBI could do in this case. It could tell us what it knows. The FBI so often hides behind this sort of sources and methods. That's what they always say. Like, well, we can't share that because we don't want to reveal our sources and methods. And I understand that in many cases, that is a valid explanation, but not in all cases. As I mentioned earlier, government is made up of people, and just like we are, we're all people, we're all equals here. And we do give them special powers at the FBI, but they should give us something in return. And I think in this case, what they should give us is an honest accounting of their knowledge and participation in the disappearance of Billy Reilly. And I will also add that the two senators from Michigan and the Reilly's local representative in the House of Representatives, after the Wall Street Journal article published in 2019, the three of them jointly wrote a letter to the Department of Justice's Inspector General requesting an investigation into the Billy Reilly case. So here we are 3.5 years later, and the DOJ IG has not even answered them. What does that tell you about FBI oversight? It's ultimately toothless.
Do you think this book will help?
I don't know if it will have any practical, changes, affect any practical changes. I hope that it would help maybe other families who are maybe sort of down the pathway to something that might turn out bad and still have time to get out. Because here's the thing, I don't think, most people don't really know the FBI well, and nor should they. Most people get their information about the FBI from movies and TV and articles here and there. But the FBI is a vast and powerful organization. And it really does a lot of interesting and valuable work, but it's an agency of people who sometimes make mistakes, and an agency of people who have ambitions, people who are trying to get promotions, just like any other office environment. But these people happen to have a gun and a badge. So, regular Americans, I think very few of them truly understand the FBI and any potential dangers that might come to them by associating themselves with it.
Have you had any reaction from Billy's parents about the book?
Yes, I think, I've gotten to know the Reileys very, very well over the years, and they've been very gracious with me. They shared so much information, whether it be like a hard drive or family history or fruits of their own investigation into Billy's case. They shared all of this willingly without caveat and without any real apparent worry over how I might misconstrue things or mischaracterize them. On the other hand, I'll say that for the Reileys, I think, and I don't want to speak for them, but I would think that the publication of this book is, it causes them to relive a fundamentally terrible chapter of their lives, and I think that that they probably need some time and space to sort of let it all sink in.
Can I ask a quick follow-on question, Brett? Have the FBI, have you had reactions from FBI individual agents or the institution more generally, or retired FBI agents?
I've had feedback from some former FBI agents who helped me in the reporting understand the agency. They've been particularly interested in how the book came out. The FBI itself, though, let me put it to you this way. At the Wall Street Journal, we have a sort of no surprises rule. That's what we call it, like meaning that if you are mentioned, or if your company or organization is mentioned in an article, it's up to us to tell you what's in the piece before it appears, so that you're not surprised when it comes out. And it's also meant to give people an opportunity to comment or to make corrections, right? So the FBI gave them more than 100 questions before the initial article appeared, and they didn't answer any of them. They gave me a simple one-line quote for the record, which said more or less that they had not dispatched Billy to Russia. And so that level of engagement has maintained throughout the process. I told them kind of when I was completing the manuscript, I called the press office and told them about the upcoming book and requested a meeting to share new findings with them, and they weren't interested.
I have an easy final question for you, Brett, and it came from the audience. It's not from me or Andrew, and it sounds like it's throwing you a lovely softball. As you researched facts for this book, did you uncover any information that might lead you down the path for your next or future books?
Oh, that comes from the audience?
Yes, and I bet it's a friend of yours, don't you think?
It's my agent.
It's not.
Yeah, I'm looking at several different things right now. The thing is, as I'm sure you all understand, that writing a book's no joke. It ends up being a significant part of your life. And for me, I really want to make each book, especially now, really count. And this book means a lot to me. This is a very personal book. I'd like to continue in that vein. And it's ideas for us are the currency. So yeah, I'm still on the lookout, let's say.
I said last question, but we got an incredibly good final question that I want to squeeze in from the audience. When reporting on the world of spies and counterintelligence, how do you prevent yourself from incorporating misinformation into your work? How do you fact check details and make sure you're not getting rolled by a source with a specific agenda? And I read that because that's a great question.
Great question. And it's something we deal with all the time. People on the outside, people who simply read what we do, it's like any profession. People outside of it are unaware of all the work that goes into it, right? Any profession. It's a constant worry, let's say, because I believe that as a journalist, you need to talk to everybody. You must talk to everybody, even if that person, say, is a spy or possibly a spy working for a country that's not your own. And often such people, the part of their job is to plant stories, to plant information in the Western press, especially when you're working at a place like the Wall Street Journal, because if something appears in the Wall Street Journal, especially like if you're outside of the country, it's like, it's believable, it's official. So we encounter that stuff all the time, and I'll tell you, so much stuff I hear, I don't use, either because it's so obviously false, or or you can't get a second source to back it up, or somebody gives you documentation and you start leafing through it and you realize, something doesn't add up here. So it is a constant worry. And a lot of it too is just kind of, you got to feel it, right? That's part of it.
Andrew, anything before I wrap it up?
I think I would just say, obviously, read the book, and if you go to Brett's website, you can read some of his other reporting, and there's been some recent stuff on Ukraine, which I think is very interesting, and the people that watch this will probably be quite, find it quite intriguing.
I like that, Andrew, you obviously went on my site, and the article you picked out was the vodka taste test.
Well, I read a lot of them, but that's the one that's stuck in my memory.
Well,
I'm just teasing.
I don't remember much, so I'm glad you do.
We might have to have you in for some live testing sometime soon in person. I want to thank you both for this incredible conversation, very challenging conversation. We'll send links to everybody. We do have the book available through the Spy Museum store. Thanks for being here. Our next program is actually in person in New York City this Saturday night. It's a dinner to honor Josephine Baker on her birthday with special guest, Jonna Mendez. And we still have just a couple tickets left for that. If anybody is interested, check our calendar for that and other super cool and challenging programs. And if you love this program, please consider making a donation to the Spy Museum. Our donors make these programs free, which I'm so delighted that we are still able to do these for free. And we also do exhibit improvements and artifact care and community outreach. So thanks for being here. We hope to see you again soon in person at a vodka tasting or online. Everyone take care and stay well.